Good morning.
Morning.
Please feel free to move your seat around a little bit if it makes it easier to see. Sometimes, especially in the chairs, we don't, what's that? The kind of offset is a little tricky. So. You don't have to see me though, you could. So I'm going to do something that does not come to me naturally. I'm going to try to talk for a shorter period of time and make more room for some questions. We've been on this topic of the 6 paramitas. I titled these talks Ancient and Practical Liberation, stressing that the ancient is not about just something that's old, but something that is really beyond time. That it's a little miraculous, actually, when you're reading those teachings that come from a couple thousand years ago, and you're like, how did they know? Or how can it be so close to what my own experience is? Well, that's because there's this quality in the teachings which isn't really bound in the kind of linear time that we're oftentimes involved in thinking about. And practical in the sense that oftentimes we think about spiritual matters as being something that's just kind of the opposite of practical. That it's something that we do on the side. We have what it takes to make life really work, what's real, and then spiritual stuff is stuff that is apart from that. And we make this kind of convenient delineation between the two, and that is a kind of mistake. Right? That actually spiritual work should be very practical. It's just that what we consider to be practical oftentimes, I would say, is reductive, which means that we're taking this unbelievable aliveness and we're turning it into an object. And practical becomes a word about how do we deal with the objects of our life. That's not the kind of practicality that Buddhist teaching is inviting us into. It's actually saying the most practical thing is to wake up to the total aliveness of being. And in that total aliveness, life works. Right? Not always the way we want, or the way we think we want, but there's something that can be followed there. And that's the path of liberation that we're interested in. And in these talks, I've been referencing the clear seeing of Avalokiteshvara, which comes right at the beginning of the Heart Sutra, which we chant every Sunday. Actually, we chant at the temple all the time. We chant in English on Sunday mornings. And so that very first line, when it says Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva, when deeply practicing Prajnaparamita, clearly saw that all 5 aggregates are empty and thus relieved all suffering. So that clear seeing, in the Chinese, we can also read it as illuminated seeing, or we could understand it as being seeing, which is illumination. That's a great thing about Chinese, right? All the words kind of fold in and out of each other. And so that if we practice these paramitas, which is Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva deeply practicing Prajnaparamita, that's the 6th of the paramitas, 6th of the crossing overs, 6th of these ancient and practical liberative practices, that 6th one, wisdom, is what animates all the other 5. Right? And wisdom is usually associated with this clear seeing, oftentimes sometimes called emptiness. Right? So let's just give you kind of where we are. If some of that didn't make sense, or you're like, I don't really know what he's talking about, it's fine. But for those of you who've been coming to these teachings, to kind of put you back in the framework that we've been working with a bit. And so I've been focusing on 5 flavors of emptiness. We might get to 32 if we just kept going and going. Actually, there's many, many, many flavors of emptiness. In fact, in the Prajnaparamita Sutras, or the teachings on Prajnaparamita, there's page after page after page of what are called different concentrations, which is another way of understanding what clear seeing is a certain way of seeing, a certain kind of concentration. And some of them are just really fantastic. They're like the concentration or the way of seeing of the total clarity of the depth of the bottom of the ocean. That would be an example of one that might be there. So I'm just talking about 5 of those, 5 that we can work with, and encouraging people to actually work with them. right? To bring them into your mind and reflect on how is it that you are seeing things, or what is the quality of seeing. And so the 5 flavors that we've been working with are the first two, that things are already broken and they're impermanent. So things are not going to stick around just in the way that I think they are. Right? They're also not even what I think they are. I don't have to wait around for them to be different than the way my mind has grasped them. So that's the first flavor. Second flavor is the total interdependence of things. Right? This one, those of you who are fond of the teachings of Zen Master Thich Nhat Hanh, this is one of the ones he focuses on the most. If you look into a piece of paper, you will see the whole universe. I love when he says that. He says, if you have the mind of a poet, you will see this. He doesn't say the mind of a Zen master or a sage or something. He says the mind of a poet. You will see that. It's nice. So second flavor. Third flavor is no place to stand. That you are totally involved in whatever phenomena that you encounter. That you can't just be an observer. So the first two, oftentimes we get in a kind of observing mind. Like, oh yeah, that thing over there is impermanent, right? Or not what I think it is. Or everything's connected. All those things out there are connected. This is the one where you realize, oh, I'm part of the picture. I'm totally involved. That thing is not out there. And then the fourth one is things just as they are. So whatever is the object of perception is not really an object of my subject, but it is just simply is. And then the last one is direct encounter. Now, if we thought about this in terms of a flower, for example, which is one of the favorite teaching subjects, you think about a flower, you behold a flower, like a Shakyamuni Buddha holding up a flower at the assembly, and Mahakashapa seeing it. Mahakashapa smiles. That's the first transmission of the Dharma in our school. We recognize that. What did Mahakashapa see? What was the Buddha displaying? Why was that a smile? This is a good question to ask. Don't answer the question though. Just have the question and let answers come, but don't hold on to any of them. But we could think about these 5 kinds of emptiness in that regard. A flower is such a beautiful symbol because we know how quickly flowers go. We know how beautiful they are. They're just called to us, you know. And so that's great, but we also know that they fall quickly, that they're not going to be around forever. And that's what makes the life of a flower so special, actually. Many things are actually as beautiful as a flower, and as intricate and as detailed, and will captivate your imagination, your perception. But this flower coming and going quickly, I think, is one of the reasons it's so beautiful. We know its emptiness in a way, its fleetingness. But that doesn't get in the way. It's actually just a full circle of whatever the life of that flower is. Impermanence is not always bad news. If we take the flower and we think about interdependence, when you're looking at the flower and you're appreciating it, you can quickly move your focus to realize that that flower is just like the placeholder for the whole garden. Like the whole garden is involved in that flower being there. And if you're lucky, maybe there will be a spider that crawls over the flower, or a bee lands in the flower or something, and reminds you that the flower is this completely dynamic shards of life and light, which are exhibiting themselves in that moment, not in isolation, but as a representative of all of this interdependent phenomena that are there. I'm speaking kind of poetically here on purpose, because that's the shift that your mind can take. Not just, oh, flower, you know, and then name the flower. What is it? You know, categorize it. Check it off on your list. My wife and I like to go see birds a lot. She likes it more than I do. But all these people with their check-off list with the birds always freaks me out. I get it. I get it, but it's sort of... I'm a little like, wow. Anyway, that's what she always says. I'm not a birder. I'm not a birder. I'm not a birder. And I was like, it's okay to be a birder. But was a kind of quality. And so both of these, like I said earlier, a little bit observational. So we have that with the flower. Now, when you're looking at the flower, if you can be a little quiet and stay there, you realize that the flower's not out there. That shift. Now, I'm saying this is something that you can actively pursue. You could eat the flower, and that wouldn't be out there. But you don't have to do that. Actually, in the seeing of the flower isn't there. In a very simple way, it's just where are you experiencing the flower? There's no externality to your experience. There's no outside of experience. There just is the fact of the flower, and you're totally involved. Right? Now, this is a subtle but really important shift in our perception, because this movement, even when we're very kind and adoring to the flower, there's a tendency to push it outside and to recede into our inside. And I'm here and it's there. And that's the kind of dynamic that we sit in. One of the reasons this is so important is because this is the only way in which we can just see the flower. When our attention's directed in one way, only that I'm seeing the flower, then the flower, my perception of the flower gets stuck. And I can't just see a flower. I just see my projection of the flower. And so the fourth flavor, the just seeing, where I just want to say, I just want to be there with the flower. I don't want to be pushing on it. I don't want to be pulling on it. I don't want to be doing anything. When you try to practice that, don't push it, don't pull it, just be with it, you'll see that you can't set yourself aside. You have to be totally involved for that to happen. And this is the place in which the total humility to meet the mystery of the flower as something which is not contained by you at all becomes possible. This is the fifth flavor. Right? So I say there's a lot of bravery in actually encountering things. And that's one of the reasons we don't do the other four flavors. Because that level of encounter with something is so alive that oftentimes that freaks us out a little bit. Like we can't keep it in the pot that's boiling over. So so this not pushing and pulling actually takes a lot of honesty. Have you ever been in a place where you just see something really captures your sense of beauty and your self drops away and then you confront something? And it's this kind of mix, oftentimes of difficulty and profundity that happen together. Anyway, I hope you have. If you haven't, just go to the woods for a while. Appreciate the moss. You have to head to the ocean now. That direction's smoky. Okay, so this is what we've been talking about. And I was summing that up by saying that you see with your heart, not with your eyes. And that all of these are ways that we pay attention to our heart. And in pay attention to our heart, we can find out something different about seeing, which changes the way life is and the way that suffering comes about. And I was, for a couple talks, emphasizing about generosity, the practice of generosity, which is the first paramita, or the first crossing over. And then we got into sila, or ethics. And in those ethics, I was really emphasizing stopping. I was emphasizing the side of ethics, which is no. No, 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 no. It's so clear. I remember when I was a middle school teacher, the day that I discovered the clarity of the word no was like a revelation. Up until that day, it was always like, well, it's probably nuanced, and we could maybe, it depends on the circumstance. And then one day it was just like, no. It's like, oh my God, freedom. No, that has its problems. But in ethical investigation, one thing I was encouraging people is just start with the no, start with the stop, then work on the subtlety, rather than the other way around. Now there has been a lot of problems with the way we think about morality, and we're just told to stop things, and there's all these power dynamics and etc. So I'm not saying we should just believe anyone's trip about morality, but I'm saying in your own investigation, when you come against something which you feel like, I need to work with this, then try the stopping and then work from there. And as we were investigating that, we made our way to kshanti, or forbearance. So I'm just going to say a few things about that, and then we should have plenty of time for questions. So Kshanti, forbearance, patience sometimes, I would say probably the least popular of the 6 paramitas, maybe tied with ethics. But deeply important. I was working with someone this week and we were talking about the practice of forbearance, and they said this really wise thing to me. They said, forbearance, but it's really hard to tell the difference between bearing something and just being stupid, right? Like just putting up with something I shouldn't put up with. And I was like, thank you. That's exactly a place we need to identify right from the beginning of thinking about the practice of forbearance. The teaching of forbearance is not simply whatever comes, I will just assume that it is okay, and I will take it upon myself to my work to just take it no matter what it is. Right? That's a kind of not wise direction of forbearance. We might have to start there though. Especially, I'm not saying you're this kind of a person, although your chances of being this kind of person, if you're sitting in this room in Eugene in the current day, is you're really freaking entitled. And you think you deserve a certain kind of treatment always. I'm not saying that's you. I'm saying probably you are. Okay? I'll let you decide for yourself, okay? And with that, any slight to that's one of the qualities you can tell if you have a kind of puffed up sense of entitlement. If you feel like you've been slighted easily, I never feel that way. That's a kind of example of what happens. And it comes oftentimes from a good place. If you've had the resources you need to live a good life, you've had people who are kind around you, you've been treated well. This is all good things, but without, and I'm going to get to why these other things are really important, without those things, oftentimes our certain sense of self-importance grows, and it's not really challenged in an environment where we're cared for with all kinds of loving kindness and a just way, etc., etc. Again, those are all great things, but they have this side that we need to pay attention to. Right? So we might need to start in a place where someone does something that's kind of jerky to us, and a technical term, by the way, jerky. And the first thing to do is sit on it. I'm not saying that's always if someone's really, really harming you. That's not the thing to do. But oftentimes that's not what's happening. Oftentimes it's a slight. It's not that big of a deal. So if you stop there and you say, okay, before I react, before I create all of the drama around the thing, let me just bear it. Let me see if it really sticks, or if I'm just looking for a chance to swing the sticks. You ever watch the monkeys fight? I remember when I was in college in an anthropology class, and they had this thing about monkeys fighting. I'll never forget it. They just start picking up sticks, and they're beating the ground and try to kick up as much dust as possible. And it's such a beautiful image. I mean, I was like, that's me. That's my heart. It'll pick up a stick, start beating things, create a commotion, because I know if I can make it big, then maybe I'll get my way. Now, sometimes we do that in defense. Again, the difference between wise forbearance and just bearing something that we shouldn't, that line we should always be paying attention. But if you can determine this isn't that big of a deal, let me just sit with it. That's a good place to study it. Okay? We can't only study it from the other side. Now, one level of the forbearance is simply to endure difficulty. In many of the classical teachings about it, it also says to endure abuse. Okay? Unjust things which are done to us, that we should endure them. This is a very tricky part of the teaching. Very tricky part of the teaching. Oftentimes, people are in situations where they cannot correct that abuse. They don't have what they need to do that. If the message is, it's your fault, you should just take it anyway, that's poison. That's poison. But that's oftentimes the message that a person hears, sometimes purposely by the people who are abusing the person. So I'm going to be really, really clear about that. And sometimes the old teachings are not very skillful in that regard. What's the difference there? What's the difference? But when we're dealing with difficulty, even when the difficulty comes to us through things that we couldn't really say are fair, or they come through the agency of other beings, we can't really escape the difficulty of that. That's what this is pointing to. We can't escape the fact that they are difficult. We can't escape the fact that they are painful. We can't escape the fact that my heart is broken because of that difficulty. But everything in my being tells me to run from that heartache, tells me to run from that heartbreak. And this perfection says, don't. Another flavor of Kshanti in the traditional text says to not be overwhelmed by the profundity of reality. And this is where running away oftentimes keeps us from doing that. Because things are painful, we split and we run. And the profound quality of reality can't reveal itself. And then the deepest level, which really I think is about this profundity of reality, is receptivity to suffering. That in the practice of forbearance or patience, to stay present with the difficulty, that itself is a deep encounter. And that deep encounter, the fifth flavor, allows for suffering to transform. To me, one of the most profound teachings within Buddhism is that suffering is not in opposition to joy. It's the biggest misunderstanding of Buddhism. People hear the teachings, the textbook thing, and they say, Buddhism teaches that everything is marked by suffering. First Noble Truth. It's true. Buddhism says that. But Buddhism doesn't say everything is marked by suffering, therefore life sucks. Right? It says that's the first noble truth. A noble traveler on the way has to forbear sorrow. And life will be marked by deep sorrows. You cannot escape that. But those sorrows do not trap you. They don't have to trap you. That actually sorrow and joy are completely inseparable. Difficulty and satisfaction, inseparable. Annoyance and intimacy, completely undividable. Boundaries and harmony, undividable. These things which seem to us as if they work against each other, they don't. And forbearance is one of the keys into that well of non-separation. When you can feel the difficulty, you can stay present with it. When you act from that place, there's something way more powerful than simply resisting the difficulty of the situation. Now, the last thing I'm going to say about this, and then I have some time for questions, is I want to point out a difference in a style of teaching which sounds very close, but in the end causes a lot of problems. And that is the difference between non-dual teachings and emptiness teachings, which sometimes sound like almost the same thing. Now, I'm using very big categories here, and it's more like Venn diagram. There's a lot of overlap and things, but I'm just going to talk about a center of gravity in these two terrains to help you process some things that you might do. And if you're not familiar with non-dual teachings, that's fine. When I start talking about it, you'll get what I mean. And it's not just that these are teachings, but they're qualities of our own heart that we might emphasize, right? And there's some issues inside of that. So although these teachings are very close, or these approaches to working with teachings like emptiness are very close, there's a little bit of a difference. And the non-dual teachings, they tend to move only in one direction. They move from complexity to singularity. And that's the direction they go. So when you're hearing those kinds of teachings, or you're telling this to yourself, all of this complexity will just go away if I can concentrate my mind correctly, or I can be emotionally attuned in the right way, or whatever it is. That the multiplicity or the complexity or the difficulty of the situation will be somehow melted into the wholeness. And in that melted into the wholeness, there will no longer be any problem, or the difficulty I'm having will go away. Usually this way of thinking, or these kinds of teachings, emphasize a kind of substructure of oneness. They say that the world, all this multiplicity is an illusion, and that actually things are just one pure consciousness, oftentimes one divine consciousness. And so the way through difficulty is to release into that oneness. And then when you find the oneness, you won't have to deal with the difficulty anymore. So I'm not saying these teachers are actually saying this. I'm saying the way we understand their teachings oftentimes is that way. Someone like very famous teacher like Eckhart Tolle, for example, if you follow some of his teachings, beautiful. He brings people to a kind of presence that's really miraculous. But oftentimes we understand those teachings to tell us whatever problem you have, it's not real. If you could just be centered enough, if you could just be mindful enough, you'd see the fundamental unity and everything would be fine. Now, this is one side of emptiness teachings. This is actually an important thing to do. Right? To be quiet enough, centered enough, that you can face difficulty and know it's melting. But emptiness teachings in the way that we're talking about here, they always go both directions. Not only from the direction of multiplicity to unity, but also from unity to multiplicity. It's the difference between, I've been saying in the past few lectures, seeing things as empty and seeing with emptiness, or seeing that seeing is emptiness, or coming to know that seeing itself is emptiness. I know that's very I don't know what you're talking about. But that's the shift that we're working with here. When you're telling yourself a story like, well, my problems aren't real, red flag, right? That's not what forbearance is asking you to do. Your problems are real. If someone is hurting you, they're hurting you. That's real. The forbearance is not there to give you a gateway to pretending like it's not happening. It's helping you embrace the actuality of the situation and the total aliveness of being so that you can respond in the most skillful way possible, which could be, right? I don't know what the most skillful way is. It depends on the situation, right? So we want to watch for that. And then if you come back to the flavors of emptiness, you will see that this one I'm emphasizing a lot right in the middle, no place to stand, that's really the key. If you decide that your place to stand is a place that is like the destruction of, that's a place to stand. Even if you're trying to destroy yourself or get yourself out of the way, that's a kind of trying to find a place to stand. No place to stand means actually you're standing. There's just no place for you to stand. That is a place from which you will see things that you're not involved in. There's no outside for you to observe the whole thing. You're completely involved. And that's challenging because it's what it means to be alive. Fantastic. Hi.
This is a very hard teaching.
Yeah.
And I when I reflect, there have been times in my life where the suffering or the abuse has been so acute, racism, homophobia, that I just long for someone to intercede.
Yeah.
Like, I wish someone would just stop this
Yeah.
on my behalf.
Yeah.
And sometimes people have, and sometimes people haven't. And I look back at those times now, and sometimes I'm glad someone interceded. Sometimes I'm glad someone did it.
Yeah.
So on the other side of those experiences, you know, I work with young people now, and I try and intercede at times, and at times I wonder if I should intercede. Can you help clarify, as a person entrusted with that responsibility to decide, how do we go about it?
Yeah. There's no place to stand as a person with responsibility. There's no place from which I become the arbiter of the situation. The intercession is the total honesty of meeting the flower. And that, the aliveness of that is, I think, what we miss when we only rely on, I'm picking my words carefully, only rely on certain protocols. Should there be certain protocols or guidelines? Yeah, I think there should be. And we need to work on those. That's in it. But that's in a community context. That's within relational figuring, like in your work at the university, for example. But we oftentimes want to put all of that anxiousness that we have about the difficulty onto those protocols rather than the actual meeting of those students, those situations, etc. And so one of the things that I really pay attention to is the nature of trust. So, you know, sending my children to school, being of mixed race, for example, that wasn't easy. And what I paid attention to was them as the people that they are, which I can't divorce myself from at all. Because their facing of whatever that injustice is, racism in this case we're talking about it, they need to feel the weight of that. I can't and shouldn't protect them too much from the weight of that, which is different than saying I shouldn't intercede if there's something unjust happening. Right? It's very tricky. If the intercession simply undermines their capacity to practice forbearance, then there's a cost to it that ultimately I don't want them to miss that. You know, I don't want them to miss that practice of forbearance. And I have to forbear it as well. I don't get to just set up a good situation in which my own encounter with the deep pain of racism isn't present. That's also, I'm required to participate. That's what I mean by no place to stand. So I think that's really what we should be focusing on when it comes to the interpersonal, and particularly when it comes to those relationships like between teachers and students in an educational setting. And then that will inevitably bring up larger questions of what we do as an institution. But I think now we're in a climate that has inverted that a bit, where the institutional factors oftentimes are focused on in a way that may undercut the capacity for this other thing to happen. This is my own experience, anyway. And I think another thing that bears saying about this is, I'm so sorry that you have to bear that, and you do, and both can be true at the same time, and that's, I think, where the real love becomes possible. Hi.
So you mentioned the clear seeing of Avalokiteshvara and the paramitas. The third eye of the Buddha. Could you please talk about that?
Yeah, sure. I thought about talking about that today, and I was like, oh, okay, now we're putting in a third list, and that two is already a little confusing. But this is another way of talking about seeing that can be really helpful. So in a traditional Prajnaparamita teaching, we say there are 5 eyes of a Buddha, or we could say just 5 eyes. And the first eye is called the eye of flesh, and that's the eye that you're used to. It's not just the flesh of your eyeball, but it is the whole part of our capacity to see, hear, feel, taste, touch, any kind of phenomena that we get through our conventionally defined sensory gates. You know, so like the fleshy eye is about seeing physical phenomena, hearing physical phenomena, touching physical phenomena, tasting, etc. The second is the divine eye, or the heavenly eye, and this is the eye that can see into different levels of being, which are not contained within materiality. They may be related to materiality, or there are things that have material qualities of being but have immaterial or other material qualities of being, and the divine eye can see that. Usually in talking about the divine eye, emphasis things like being able to see very, very, very far away, or being able to hear something, or seeing into the future, or those kinds of things. So the first eye is usually thought of as being, everyone is endowed with it. If you talk about eyes, that's what they're talking about. But a person of a spiritual practice, their divine eye will also start opening, and you start to see into other worlds. Then the third eye is really where the Buddhist practice starts, or is really in full swing. And that's the prajna eye, the eye of wisdom. And the prajna eye sees nothing, would be the very terse explanation of what the prajna eye is. Like total darkness. Or we could say infinite light in which nothing can be differentiated. So that eye has no seer or seen, no phenomena actually. From the root of that eye, the fourth eye is the Dharma eye. And the Dharma eye is where every phenomena is a teacher. Every phenomena is the Dharma, is the truth. So this is a little bit like the third and the fourth flavor I've been talking about. The third flavor, where there's no place to stand, is hard to grasp any phenomena at all. But in the fourth, it's just things just as they are. Just as they are, they're preaching the Dharma. And then the fifth eye is the Buddha eye, which is the eye which can use all 5 eyes totally freely, integrates them seamlessly. They're not really different eye to a totally awakened being. That's the kind of teaching. Why I think this teaching is important in practicing or in studying the paramitas is there is the place where we have to give up on perceiving anything. And that's emphasized in the Prajnaparamita teachings, that we release our attachment to experience. That doesn't sound that easy, but it's even way, 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 way harder than how difficult it sounds. But it's not hard in the sense that it's really, really strenuous. It's like this slight move that we almost always miss because we're turning things out into the fleshy eye or the divine eye constantly. So that's the basic teaching of the 5 eyes.
Yes, but what I was getting at specifically was the prajna eye.
Yeah.
which informs the paramitas. So that's very specific.
Yeah, the prajna eye forms the paramitas because it is the eye of wisdom, which is the sixth paramita, and that's where generosity as a paramita becomes possible. That's where ethics as a paramita becomes possible. It's where kshanti or forbearance becomes possible as a paramita. Vigor becomes possible as a paramita. Without the eye of wisdom, they're good things to do. Highly recommend it. But they won't carry you over. They will produce good karma, is the classical way to talk about. They'll make life better, but they won't liberate. And so the liberation is really the important thing that Buddhism is focusing on. And that's the animation of the prajna. Hi.
So, in the few times that I've crept close to no place to stand, I think what comes to me is prostration. It's just humility, you know? And then trust or faith, you know? And I think then standing up, and I know in past Dharma talks you've talked about how do we take a bite of this peach, you know? How do we act, you know, from there? And, you know, maybe you just answered the question in describing the 5 eyes when you said it's all Dharma, you know? But from there, I feel within myself the reluctance to make a mistake, to hurt someone, the fear of, you know, myself being silly. Whatever, there's many, many reasons why to stay inert, you know. And could you talk a little bit about just that dragon fire or the ability to take risks, the willingness to take risks, etc.?
So back into the framework that I was using, the third flavor, no place to stand, when you really taste that, it's like forehead on the ground. Whether you literally do that or not, but you realize, oh, I'm not looking from over here. And when you know that it you know, there's a reason that people pray like this. There's a reason when we prostrate, they're like this. There's a reason that our palms are up during meditation. You know, sometimes you have some problems with your thing, you might meditate like this, but there's a reason that it's up. That's the reason. So from there, then you prostrate, but you also stand up. The prostration isn't just going down. The prostration is also coming up. And in the coming up, there's the practice of the fourth flavor, which is just see it. Don't pull on it, don't push it. Feel for all the ways, all the subtle ways in which you'll push or pull on this, whatever the phenomena is that you're working with. So there's a practice there. Don't push it, don't pull it. Don't push it, don't pull it. Don't push it, don't pull it. Just stay present. And because we're so habituated to think that presence means to push or pull, presence means, oh, grab it and bring it closer to me and let me hold on to it tight. That's what we usually think presencing means, but that's not what this presence is, right? And you learn that in the prostration. And so you just have to keep, it's like continual prostrations, but prostrations there with the phenomena. If you do that, what you'll discover is that that flower is a raging goddess of fire. And she won't be like so, you have to meet her. She's not an object of your life. When we're afraid of the hurting and all of those kinds of things, we're still slightly stuck in that whatever it is still an object of my perception. If you think about a person, you know, they're still, you know, my daughter, they're still my whatever. And I'm going to, and I need to hold them in this certain way. When you can face them without that push and pull, then you realize actually the only way to truly meet this person is to meet them with the honesty and humility to know that they are completely themselves. And it's not my practice to do anything to that other than to actually genuinely meet. And genuine meeting means I don't get to manipulate, I don't get to pitch in any direction, I actually have to just meet. My God, that's so hard. But that's really what these are pointing us to. And it's not always, sometimes that's a very deep, I say like fiery goddess with fire. I mean, that's the way I experience that oftentimes. And so that's very dramatic. But that fiery goddess is also my wife. And so, I feel very lucky that we've been able to cultivate a relationship where that kind of honest meeting is at the base. And we're held accountable to that day after day after day after day. You can forge relationships based on that, but it's different than I got a hold of you, right? It's this other thing. And it's why it's so challenging, but also why it's so important, and why annoyance and intimacy are inseparable. Yeah. So I'd really encourage you, because what you told me is totally true, and it's also a kind of story of limitation that you don't have to live in. Actually, you can do the practice. The story of limitation is true. I mean, we're all doing that all the time. So it's like, okay, great, wake up to that. But now go, okay, there's another possibility. The other possibility is when I come up from the prostration, it's almost automatic. It's like, or like that. And so right when you're coming from the prostration, feel for that. And then
For that next encounter.
feel for the place where you're going to grab or push away. Right? So you go from the prostration, which is like the third flavor, which is like just giving it up. And then as you stand up and you behold whatever this is, then that's the point where the quickness with which your karmic mind will grasp the object of your awareness is incredibly fast. So you're feeling for it. And you probably will catch yourself grasping, and then you have to relax the grasp. You probably won't get ahead of it most of the time, but that's fine. And you practice again and again until it becomes more natural to come up from the prostration and just be, as opposed to coming up from the prostration and kind of enforcing your agenda, which oftentimes is very wholesome. It's very loving. But that itself is also a problem, right? It's like, don't enforce the loving agenda. It's actually, take the Buddha as your model. He has a little smile, but he's not like, let me hold you, right? He's just boom. And then in that place, something else becomes possible. And yeah. Anyway, I'm excited. Hi.
My question might be maybe another flavor of
Sure.
that question. Oftentimes in response to difficulty, when I don't just go to sit with it right from the start, my reaction is to I want to fix this. And sometimes I think I practice forbearance and so, okay, take a step aside, and then, but that sense is still there of there's something really the matter here, and I can do something. Maybe I can have some kind of positive impact here. And that fixing is still there. That fixing, intention. But can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, just don't separate the fixing from the sorrow of it. That's the real thing. It's not a problem, especially we're oftentimes talking about like, don't try to fix it, don't try to fix it, don't try to fix it. And that's a good teaching, but we also need to try to fix it. But the issue is that when oftentimes we just rush to try to fixing it as a way to escape the presencing with the difficulty of it. And if we can presence with the difficulty of it, the fixing can work in a different kind of way. But when the two get separated from each other, that's the issue. And depending on who we are, how our heart works, and our constitution, and maybe sort of how big the bowl is of things we can hold at once, which by the way, having the bigger bowl is not necessarily better. Like if you're like one bite at a time person, there's a lot of advantages to that. And like how many complex emotions and feelings and thoughts can you hold all at one time? I'm a person who kind of holds a lot, And that has some advantages, but has some disadvantages too. Sometimes I wish I was like those ice cream tastes at the place, you know, where you only get like one little taste at a time. It seems like that might be a better way to live. Just have the taste, don't have the bowl at all. But if you're a person with this kind of like a little bit bigger bowl, you're inevitably going to have that. The fixing isn't going to just shut down. You're going to have the feeling of like there could be something that can be done about this, and I know that. But I know if I get disconnected from the actuality of the difficulty of the situation, I'm going to run off and kind of spill over the side. And then sometimes in a meditation retreat, or if there's a certain kind of concentration that arises, that might spill away, and that's good. But I wouldn't fight with yourself about it too much. Just allow it to be there. But and then notice how it might pull you from the real difficulty or sorrow of the particular situation.
Yeah, sometimes it's just
Yes, yeah. And that's also, so I would say that's also what forbearance can take us to, is it can take us down to, probably starting next week, we'll start talking about vigor. And it's really interesting, the classical imagery around forbearance, particularly in like Shantideva's Guide to the Way of the Bodhisattva, which is a text that's very popular in Tibetan Buddhism. Good text to study. All the imagery is fire. So forbearance imagery for Shantideva is all fire. So part of it's like staying present with the burn. But that staying present with the burn, one of the reasons it's so important is because that's where vigor comes from. That's where zeal comes from, or that's where the kind of intensity for transformation is possible. When we lift off of it, that part of us that just goes, wants to do that, that's good, actually. But what do we do with that becomes the answer. And vigor gives us a way to channel it through Buddhist practice, which allows for a liberation to happen rather than to just blow the steam off, which we all do plenty of too. But it gives us, but the practice gives us a way of doing this other thing. And you can see that happen in, if you think about, again, in interpersonal relationships, where if you're able to stay with some hurt long enough and be pissed about it, you can actually come to the table in a way in which the relationship can be deepened and stronger intimacy and trust can be built. But if you don't stay with the hurt enough to get pissed off about it, then you don't really, you start drifting apart. Yeah. I'll say that. Stay there. Hi.
It's the first time that I heard the teaching of non-duality and emptiness as sort of different.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you spoke of impermanence. Is it sort of that impermanence is both very, very real and very important to walk through and acknowledge, and also a fiction, and sort of the trick to not be non-dual is that these two are the push and the pull, and that standing in the middle would be sort of the thing, the not pushing and pulling would be, and that's sort of like I think I heard somewhere from the two as the one, throw out the one as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah. Our mind gets captured by the idea of oneness, and that's very strong pull in us, and it's spiritually vibrant, and so to be able to move from multiplicity to singularity, or that direction, is really important. And a lot of that comes from recognizing impermanence, letting go of grasping, realizing the wholeness of things, as opposed to this struggle that I'm having with an individual piece of it, or a big like attachment I'm having to a certain part of it. So that movement's really important. But what emptiness says is there's not an underlying oneness which you arrive at and then dismiss the multiplicity. That actually, when you let go of that way of dealing with phenomena, their wholeness then shows up as the face of whatever it is that you're meeting. And I think many non-dual teachers will teach in that way, but oftentimes we don't hear it that way, and or they don't teach it that way. They emphasize they emphasize that wholeness part of it. So another way we could think about it is whatever you're looking at, if you pay attention to it in this way that I'm talking about, by the time you get to the fifth flavor, it's looking back. You're not just looking at it, it's looking back. And you now are encountering the being as opposed to encountering the object of your mind, which is what we usually are doing. Even if we think we're meeting another being, we're meeting we've objectified them in some way. So that's our goal. And sometimes we start with just, the stuff's looking back. Just recognize it. And when you recognize it, then that can work the other direction too. You're like just consider things as being alive. That's not so hard. But then when you're moving around and you're like, oh, do I want to step on the pavement? That's not nice. The pavement's alive. But then you realize, oh, the nature of pavement is total solidity. It probably loves having you walk on it. Everything you touch touches back, we could say. I don't know if that was an answer or not, but this is my reply.